So anyway, we worked on it for a full weekend. We painted it. We did the collage and all that. And that was the first time we both realized that we worked together very well.
Yeah.
Which it's like a unicorn to find another creative that you work with well.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean,
that was when I first started thinking about marrying her.
Oh, welcome to the TheKnifeWife podcast. I'm Suz, married to Bob Terzuola. This podcast is about couples who live, love, and work together. It has little to do with knives. Hey everybody, we're back. And they're letting us come in the doors. They're not locking us out. Here we are for the TheKnifeWife podcast. We're going to have some great guests with us today that are very close to us and have a tremendous story about working together for a really long time. And people say to me, what is your podcast about? I said, well, it's about everything and it's about nothing. It's questions that nobody asked that we answer. I don't know what to call it. And we don't use Wikipedia because I am married to Wikipedia.
That's me, Bob.
Here
I am.
And we hope to give everybody a break from all the toxic media and all the negative stuff that goes on that we're bombarded with every day and give you sort of a respite from that. So here we are today with Dan and Anna Terzuola, who I call Dana very often. I don't mean to benefit them, but they're in Guatemala. Say hello, Anna and Dan.
Hello.
Hello.
They can't see us, but we can see them. So it makes me very happy. Anyway, Dan and Anna are really professional creatives. I never knew what that term was until, okay, Bonnie Christine, I'm giving you a shout out, until I went to her meeting in Charleston. And I realized, and she told me, you're a professional creative. All you do is create things, make things happen. And pretty much that's what Anna and Dan do, too. And we talked a little bit about ideas. So I'm going to start there. So Anna, talk to me about how you get ideas and how they become something.
Okay. Well, I think the first part of an idea is you have to let go of the embarrassment that the idea might sound stupid or too out there or too ridiculous. Because you can't really explore an idea if you're putting limits on yourself or the idea. Ideas should be or should sound crazy the first time you say them, and then you keep exploring the idea, you keep talking about it, you then kind of figure out ways of making it real.
Exactly. I have lots of crazy ideas, that I say to Bob, like, oh, how about doing a podcast? He's like, what?
I don't think it's about the idea. It's about the execution. Because you can bring any idea to life with, a level of professionalism that you want. You just have to find a way to make it, work, because I think that the crazy ideas are the ones that attract people the most.
Exactly. I don't want to do something someone else has already done. I'm not interested in that at all. I'm not interested in working for someone else really either. And because, I have these ideas. And you talked a little bit about a process. You called it a notion. Did you say the word notion?
Yes. I have notion. I mean, it's like my brain is always working in the background. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And because I'm a mom, there's a lot of repetitive tasks that need to happen every single day. And a lot of times I'm in those repetitive tasks, cooking or laundry or taking a kid to the bathroom or whatever. And something will just pop into my head. Like I call them notions. And then I start to build on that notion because for some reason, it's like a little seed that gets planted and the plant just starts growing. It's like a process that I control part of it and part of it I don't control.
Yes.
Because some notions, maybe I'm not driven to explore any further. They're just like, 2 days and then it goes away by day 3. But then there are others that just stick with me. They won't go away and I have to explore them further. And then, I have to find a way to make it real, which is very fun too. I like both the creative part and then the very pragmatic, real part of making it an actual project.
Yeah, and I think you're a very visual thinker, as I think Dan is too, and I am. And we were talking, and I said, I get this movie starts in my head when someone's talking to me or telling me a story, or when I'm thinking of something. This movie begins, and I see these pictures in my head. And until I met other artists, I didn't realize other people had pictures in their heads too. And I thought, maybe a little nutty. I certainly didn't share this with my parents. And so then when I met other artists, they all have the same thing, and you have the same thing. And what I think is cool is that when you have these notions, then Dan takes over, and out comes the book, right?
Yes.
Dan, tell us about the book.
We'll talk about the coffee shop later, but I very much felt it with the coffee shop, where I would just have a notion, an idea, and then I'd be like, Dan, make it real. And he would.
He does. So Dan, tell us about the book.
Yes, I have several notebooks. There's always a notebook handy around me, and each project, depending on the size of the project, will get a notebook. Like, if it's a small project, I have a notebook that's just for general ideas and small things that only take a few pages to kind of sort out in my mind. And then for bigger projects, they'll get their own book that when I'm really thinking about how to build a building or some mechanical device or something that's just kind of more complicated than a few pages will handle, it'll get its own book. And then what I love is filling that book and kind of exploring the idea to its fullest. Like I'll go through the pages of the notebook and be like, what haven't I thought about? And look for the holes in the idea, and then that idea that's missing gets a page.
Okay, your dad does a very similar thing, right, Bob?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. Especially when
Crazy.
I'm preparing for a Zoom call or a deep dive video or something, I have to lay it out in fairly good detail what I'm going to do. Now, I don't always use it like a script. If I'm on camera being filmed or something, I won't always be, looking back and forth at the script. But it helps to organize my mind. I think the same as what you're saying, Dan, is you get all the component parts and you kind of put them together and you kind of see how it's going to look on paper. That's not always how it's going to look in real life, but it's sometimes pretty close.
Yeah.
See, for me, I have a notebook, but I guess I just sort of write out a list of key words or phrases. And then when I look at it, it triggers my memory. And I know what I meant.
Yeah, I have a similar thing. I have a notebook that the bottom half, I think I showed you when you visited, the bottom half of the notebook page is lined papers, lined like a notebook paper, and the top is blank. And a lot of times I get these ideas in my mind, and I don't have time to actually draw it. When my kids were little, I was, especially Alex, I was, on the run all the time. And so I would quickly write down, exactly what you talked about, key words that described the picture I got in my head. Many years later, when probably my daughter was, in her 20s, she said to me, I really think that the one thing I would like when you die, I'm like, oh, really? Are we talking about this now? Is your notebooks, because when I watched you do your art and your prints, she said, I saw them in your notebooks when you were sitting with your coffee in the morning drawing them. And she said, I would really I think those are really important. And I have a whole box of them. I've carried them all over to every move. With that in mind, I'm not sure that's what will happen. But anyway, visual people also are organized people because we have to make those visions come true.
But honestly, if somebody found my notebooks and then tried to understand them, I don't think they would.
Ooh, they'd prescribe medication?
I don't know. I have like an organized chaos. It's organized for me. Well, but I don't think if somebody else saw the book, they'd get it.
Yeah. And you juggle a lot of things, as I juggle a lot of things.
I was just curious, Anna, since you're a native-born Guatemalan, when you write down your key words, are they in Spanish or English?
Oh, at this point, it's Spanglish. It's just
Spanglish, okay.
Yeah.
I've learned that language very well. Yes, Spanglish, okay.
Okay, yeah. But I was going to say is that I have a really low tolerance for boredom, and I think Anna does too. And I don't know about Dan, but I know Anna does too. And we were talking, and she was talking about how she works. And what were you saying yesterday about a week of this, a week of that?
Oh, yes. That the only way that I can be like professionally entertained is if I'm not just doing one project every single week, every day, the same thing, because it just kills my spark.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It just kills it.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I worked in advertising as a graphic designer, because I was going to the same place and sitting at the same desk every day, I just felt my creativity just go down.
Yeah.
So working on multi-projects like we're doing now is actually less overwhelming to me than just having one project. So I'll do one project 1 week, or even like one project 2 days, and then on day 3 I switch to the other project, or I take the whole week. But the point is that I'm always like jumping in between.
It's a
I think
revolving
yesterday
door.
I said I was like a hummingbird.
Yeah, it's a revolving door or carousel. I do the same thing.
Yeah.
Like today is podcast day. And after we
Mhm.
do the podcast, I'll go home and I'll make notes to myself about another podcast or things that I want to remember or change. And the night before, I also type up the notes I sent you, just sort of an outline, so we have something to follow. But when I was going to say, I was thinking, both of you have incredible high intelligence. And I'm not saying that because you're our kids. You do. And when I first met Dan, I'm going to embarrass him. And I saw he made a sculpture that we have at our house. And he showed me some of his writing, and he was rapping all the time. But he would be rapping and listening to us at the same time and be able to have a conversation. He'd break the rap, he'd answer the question or say something, and then go back to it. And he was doing all these things, and I was like, Bob, he's gifted. This
I
kid
know.
is
It
gifted.
used to drive me crazy.
Bob, I get it. I've lived with it too. And I also at times have been like, would you just stop?
I know. I passed it on to
Still
you.
beat marks.
Yeah.
I don't think we mentioned, Susan, that Dan is my son. One of my sons.
Yes, he is.
Did
we
we
didn't mention that. I don't know what we said, Terzuola.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yes, he is. They seem to be growing in number as of last year. Now there's 3. Yes. So Dan, he loved comic books. He always loved comic books. And he loved graphic novels, and he loves to read. And he majored in literature, which is no surprise. But when he moved down to Guatemala, he opened a store, which I'll let you tell everybody about, Dan, that sounded like such a fun job to me. So, and I grew up in a retail store, but it sounded like much more fun than the retail store I grew up in. So tell us a little bit about it and the name and how you came up with that.
Well, back in 2011, I founded a comic books and vintage pop culture store called iRobot here in Antigua, Guatemala. And as far as I can tell through the historical record, we were the very first comic books themed store in the country. And it was just this amazing kind of organic process that came about. I was looking for something to do in Guatemala. I had saved a little bit of money to start a business. And somebody mentioned to me that you couldn't get comic books in Guatemala. And I was like, no comic books in Guatemala. It was 2011, right after Marvel Cinematic Universe took off, so it seemed like a really good idea. So the light bulb went off, and I decided to go ahead and advance on this project. And I had no idea what I was doing.
That's the best way to do it.
Got to start somewhere.
So we just rented a space in Antigua, and I literally had nothing to put in the store. The first thing we had was just somebody donated their comic book collection to us to have. And actually, I drove from New Mexico down to Guatemala with a car loaded with records and comic books for the store, thinking that was going to be enough to get me started. But once I actually put what we had out in display, it was nothing. Like the
Yeah.
store felt very empty. Like there was just like one table in an empty room with some comics on it. And so the very first year was a little bit difficult and kind of strange figuring out how businesses work really, and learning Spanish. Like, you can't make sales if you can't speak the language. So really, there was a lot of it was a high learning curve. But ultimately, the comic store was successful. I really loved doing it, and B, it past the first year, it actually started providing for me because it was a success. I connected with a lot of graphic artists, a lot of authors, and it became part of like the zeitgeist of Guatemala at the time. And the store was being fairly successful. That was when Comic-Con first came to Guatemala, and we started having more and more events, and it felt like a lot of the geeks and the nerds and the social outcasts really connected to the idea that there was a place for them that accepted them and then promoted the things that they were into, where they could come and just have a discussion. Like that was one of the things that I really loved about the comic book store was people would just come in and talk to me for hours. Every now and then I'd be like, "Yeah, you can leave now."
And someone came in that was really a key part in your dad's life. I want to make sure you tell a story of one of the people who came in.
In the first year, we really didn't have any product to sell. It was really difficult to import comics. Sourcing this stuff was really difficult. And, it was easy to find certain things like old 80s toys were around, and there was a market for them. But finding modern comics or even back issues, people would come in and ask for Spider-Man number 252, and I'd be like, I could try ordering it for you. It might take 6 months, And then one day, this woman came in and she said, "Do you guys buy comic books?" And I said, "Yes, we do. What have you got?" And she had been pulling this suitcase down the cobblestones of Antigua, and she puts it down on the floor in the empty comic book store and opens it up, and it's filled to the brim with 1940s and 50s comic books from America and from Latin America, from Chile. And I was like, "Oh, I'm definitely interested." She had just thrown them into the suitcase and then walked with it down the street. So everything was kind of like mashed up in there. And she said, "Well, this belonged to my grandfather, and he used to illustrate He-Man." And I was like, "Really? He used to illustrate He-Man?" And she said, "Yeah, he was a comic book artist in Chile in the 1950s, and then, eventually worked his way up through Guatemala and then into America. And that he had just recently died, and they were trying to clear out the room he had lived in, and that it was filled top to bottom with comic books." I said, "Okay, I definitely have to see this." So I go out to this village outside of Guatemala City called El Naranjo. And, this house was in the middle of nowhere. It took us forever to find it. It was not, connected to anything really. And we find this house, and sure enough, there's a room that floor to ceiling is filled with comic books dating all the way back to, like, I think the earliest ones I found were from 1912. And, there was everything in there. I was like, if I'm ever going to find Superman #1, this is the moment. And, I didn't really hesitate. I just said, "Okay, what do you want for the whole room?" And I ended up spending my entire life savings to buy this room. And while we were there going through the stuff and talking, the man's name was Sergio Garcia Moreno. And they had all his original comic art from Chile, like really famous things. Apparently, he's a really famous artist in Chile, second only to Alejandro Jodorowsky, is what I've been told. But going through all the things, his granddaughter or his daughter said, "Oh, he made the very first comic book in Guatemala." And I was like, "Really? my dad wrote the very first comic book in Guatemala. And so I tell this story to you, Pop, and I'm like, hey, I just had this experience. I just bought a bunch of comics. They say the guy wrote the first comic book in Guatemala. Who was the artist that made the comic book he wrote? And you started describing the guy. You were like, oh, he was a Chilean artist who used to work for Marvel Comics. And I was like, oh my God, I think this is true. And I went back a few times to the house to empty out the room. We couldn't do it in one trip. And we found a copy of the original comic book. And we found the paperwork from USAID that had my dad's name on it. And the comic book itself was really interesting. Like, what would you think the very first Guatemalan comic book would be? It was a guide for campesinos on how to apply for loans from the municipality to buy pesticide.
An exciting read, I'm sure. But tell us, Bob, tell us a little bit about why you did that comic book.
I'm sure it didn't rate as high as Superman #1. But Sergio was hired on this program that I was working on called the Basic Village Education Program. And it was a long-term, actually 7 or 8-year study on the effects of mass media of communication on subsistence-level farmers. And could we get subsistence-level farmers to increase their crop loads, their yields? And we did various projects. We built 2 radio stations, one in the Indian Highlands and one in the Latino areas close to El Salvador. But we also had Sergio. We hired him directly from New York. He came down from New York to put together comic books. We called them, they weren't really comic books. They were instruction manuals printed and drawn in very simplistic terms, because the early studies showed that literacy among the rural Guatemalan campesinos was only about 46%. It was fairly low. So we used as few words as possible, and some of them we experimented with no words at all. Later on, we did another study.
And then you also, what did you do with those radio stations? You didn't tell us what you did.
Well, we had production studios in Guatemala City, and we would produce basically what they called radio novelas, which is soap operas.
He's a soap opera producer,
Yeah,
folks.
I
He doesn't just make
I was a soap opera
knives.
producer for a while. Yeah, not a writer. I didn't do the writing, but I helped produce them and put them together. We had agronomists, and we had families that would, families on the programs that would go through these drama serials, basically a soap opera serial day after day. But they would talk about, the farmer would come in from the field saying, oh, I've got this problem with the gallina ciega, which is a type of worm that eats into the corn borer is
right.
what they call them. And he'd be talking to his wife, Maria, and they'd say, what am I going to do about this? And then we would have, sure enough, here comes the local agronomist, and he would tell Jose and Maria what to do with the corn borer and how they could take care of it and didn't have to use pesticides and all sorts of things like that. And basically, those were the programs that we put out over the 2 radio stations, in conjunction with things like music and local events and so forth. But we tried to increase the yield of subsistence-level farmers using this mass media, both the visual, which was Sergio's, if you want to call them comic books,
Graphic novels,
and the soap operas. And actually, after a 7-year study, it turned out that it was actually quite a successful program.
Yeah, that was my next question. Did it help?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
So I feel like that was for Dan, that was like a green light that he would meet this guy opening up this comic book store that knew you. It was like, okay.
Well, he had passed away by then.
No,
Yeah,
but I
I
mean
never
that he
met
would
him.
meet. I'm sorry, he would meet the daughter of this
The
guy.
daughter.
Still,
But still,
I mean,
what
what
are
are
the
the
odds?
odds?
Exactly, the odds are
Yeah,
just
right.
whatever. So it was sort of like I don't know, a big arrow pointing Dan. Yes, you are here. Keep doing this.
It definitely felt like it was a confirmation that this was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so
And
you also went to Comic-Con because your dad flew to San Diego before we moved here and met
yeah,
you.
so in the first year of the comic book store, right during this whole Sergio Garcia thing, I think it was kind of even been like the same week that I was emptying out the house. These two British documentary filmmakers came down, and we met them randomly, and we told them what we were doing, and they were like, "We would love to make a documentary about you." So they did. They filmed us, and they filmed me, like I think, going through some of the Sergio Garcia stuff and talking about how fascinating it was, because there was so much stuff in there that was really interesting. It wasn't just old vintage comics. It was also all these like what you were making, these guidebooks for campesinos in different countries. Like a lot of the Mexican ones were really interesting.
Mm.
Anyway, so I talked a lot about that in the documentary, and then I forgot that they existed completely. These guys, and about 2 years later, they contacted me and they were like, "Hey, we made the documentary. It won a bunch of awards, and now they're going to be showing it at Comic-Con. And could you come and answer questions on a panel about your documentary, about your comic book stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds great." I've been looking for an excuse to go to Comic-Con, and I got to be a professional there. I had the professional badge and backstage access and all that sort of thing. And that trip also proved to be a pretty huge boon to the business, because it put me in contact with all these American sources of comic books,
Mm-hmm.
and people that were also trying to get their book to go international.
Mm.
So I remember coming back from Comic-Con not only with 3 suitcases of comic books, but also a giant bag of business cards that ended up being hugely beneficial to us.
Great. What a great story. And we always try to have an amusing or funny story. And you did tell me one story about the store being robbed that you might want to share with us.
Well, so on the block that the comic book store was on, it was on Sexta Avenida in Antigua. You can't really rely on the police to kind of show up and do what they're supposed to do. So there was this weird alarm system that all the businesses on the block had connected back, I don't know when, they put in this thing back in the 90s or something. But it was an alarm system that if you hit this button on the wall, it set off the alarms in all the neighboring businesses. And
Mm-hmm.
so one day we had this worker who was a bit of an eccentric
Yeah.
is one way to put it. And he was I think even volunteering at the comic book store. He just wanted to be in there. And some guys came in and they just closed the door to the comic book store and pulled out a gun, and they were like, "Give us all the money in the drawer and give us your computer and your phone and everything that you have of value." And rather than do any of that, he just jumped up on the desk, grabbing his computer, and just started screaming until the neighbor heard him through the wall and set off the alarm, at which point all the businesses come running out, all the business owners come running out onto the street, and they're like, "What's going on?" They're like, "They're robbing the comic book store." At which point the robbers start sensing that they're being closed in, and they just turned around and ran off. That was the end of that. But it was quite a scene.
And the guy, the employee who was there and did that, he's telling us the story like so pumped, like the adrenaline is still rushing, and he's not scared or traumatized. He's smiling and telling everybody the story like the greatest adventure ever.
Well,
I
it
told
could have
him, I was
been.
like, why didn't you just give them the money out of the register? It's not worth your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your grandmother did a very similar thing, which your father's going to tell the story. When she worked where did she work?
She worked at Kresge's, which turned into Kmart, and she was kind of a manager, and she would double at the cash register every once in a while. And some guy came in with a gun, and she threw something at him, and he ran out, and she ran after him down the street on the sidewalk, and she came back, and the supervisor said, "Wait, Joe, you're crazy. What were you doing? He has a gun." Said he tried to rob me. and she I don't know. My mother was like that. She's just very impulsive.
Oh,
But I wanted to ask Anna, at this time, were you working with Dan at the comic book store? Had you guys met at this
No,
time yet?
no. We had already met. When I met him, he already had the store, but he didn't start the store with me.
Ah,
And then, he had started it with his ex-girlfriend, and then they broke up, and she left, and then the store was just Dan's.
and we're very happy about that, by the way.
yeah. Yeah.
I met him, and at first, I think like many couples, it was sort of like, this is his thing, and I have my own thing over here, because I was working as a graphic designer and a teacher at the time. And then, Dan kind of would ask my input on a few things, especially the graphic stuff. Like I remember the first thing I did was improve the logo. Remember?
Yeah, she made the logo that we used for years.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then you did my business card.
Yeah, and then I did his business cards. And so I started slowly to kind of involve myself in iRobot, but it was still very much like Dan's business.
Right.
But then it was a few years in when Dan had moved the comic shop to a different location. That was the front part was his comic store. And then if you kept walking through, you went to the restaurant that was not his, obviously, in the back. So at night, he needed to close off his store so that the restaurant customers wouldn't be messing with stuff. So he had this idea to do this room divider made out of plywood, and that we would decorate the whole thing in collage. And I thought, what a fun project. I mean, it was 8 panels, I think.
No, it was 5.
5 panels.
Cut and paste is a fun thing for us artists. We love cut and
Yeah,
paste.
and on each panel, we could do something different,
And the art that we were collaging with was most of it came from the Sergio Garcia collection.
Right.
Things that were too damaged to save or sell.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a bunch of Dan Dare comics from the 1950s.
Did you say
British
Dan
sci-fi
Dare?
comics.
Dan Dare?
Dan Dare.
Like Dan Dare Terzuola?
Yeah. So those got collaged. And then there's this other, I want to say he's Argentinian artist named Boixcar, Boixcar. And he was doing kind of Forbidden Planet, World of the Future, 1950s Soviet propaganda from Latin America kind of style art.
Of course, everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah,
It's very common.
Usual stuff.
Speaking
And
of-
so we used that to do the collage.
But it was really fun to work within that theme. And we would just be, cutting up, one had this 1940 style astronaut illustration that was really cool. And so we cut him up and we collaged him with a dinosaur in the background.
Or just a mass of tentacles in front of him.
So anyway, we worked on it for a full weekend. We painted it, we did the collage and all that, and that was the first time we both realized that we worked together very well.
Yeah.
Which it's like a unicorn to find another creative that you work with well.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean,
That was
really.
when I first started thinking about marrying her.
Oh, okay. Well, we liked her right away. We just saw her on a Zoom call or I don't know what it was. But Bob, I think when you were at Comic-Con, Bob got to do the Zoom call with Anna, and he came home and he said, "Susan, Dan has met the one." And I said, "Really? Better than the last one?" He goes, "Oh, my God." What a night and day difference. Anyway, I mean, we both had that with our kids going, oh my God. Anyway, because you don't get a vote. So you did do a project together. You did sort of do a comic or a graphic novel together, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
we
yes.
so one of the artists that we hooked up with that was regularly doing graphic stuff for iRobot was this kid named Luis de Leon.
Yeah.
And he was 17 at the time.
Yeah.
He was young.
No. Well, I think he had just graduated high school. He might have been in his first year of university, but he was young.
He was young, but he was a talented artist,
Yeah.
and we liked what he was producing. And he approached us, being like, "Have you guys ever thought about printing a comic book and distributing it through the store?" And I was like, I've sort of played with the idea a little bit, but nothing's really pushed me to do it. And he had a whole portfolio of art that was pretty much ready to go. All he needed was the funds and the location to sell it and the story. And so Anna is a graphic designer, and she knew how to do book layout and all that sort of thing. And I was happy to slap the iRobot logo on a product, and then help guide the kid about what it is that we thought would work. And we ended up together, the three of us, collaborating on this one little book. What's the name of it?
Reglas de protocolo existencial. Rules for existential protocols. Something like that. No.
There we go. Very common
Something
themes.
along those lines, translated.
Sounds great. I never saw it, but I would love to see it. Do you have a copy of
There's
that, Bob?
probably a copy there at Pop's house.
At Pop's house?
your house.
Well, when I go there sometime, I'll check it out. I'll check it out. Anyway, so that wasn't enough. You guys have one of these notions, these ideas came up to build something on top of a mountain. And we're going to get into that and not probably finish the whole story of the fantasy. So tell us the story of how that came about, your next project together, which was really together.
Okay. Well, it all started literally one night in our apartment. We had a roommate at the time who had gone out to a bar, and we had just stayed home watching a movie. And then the roommate came back, late at night, like 1:30, 2 a.m. And he told us, I just met this guy who owns this piece of land on top of a mountain. And he says that the view is just incredible. Because, here in Guatemala, we have volcanoes. And so he said you can see 3 volcanoes, and on a clear day, you can see 5 volcanoes, 7 volcanoes.
You told me that when I was there. You told me that. And it was cloudy the whole time, and there were no volcanoes. And I believe you're all delusional, and there are no volcanoes in Guatemala. Not really.
It's sad that you came during the time of the year that you came in, because that's the foggy time. But then there's other times of the year that are crystal clear views.
Like now, for instance.
All right.
Anyway, so he comes home and he's telling us, this guy has this piece of land and it's beautiful. And he says that it kind of feels like you're up at the Shire from The Hobbit, and that it's just magical. And I remember, he was going on and on about this, and he was a little drunk. So, the way he was talking was just kind of annoying to me. And we were in the middle of the movie, which we had to pause, that I don't even remember what movie it was now. But I was so annoyed that he had interrupted that I kind of didn't really pay attention. And like I said, he was also a little bit drunk, so I didn't take him seriously. But then the next day, after he had sobered up, he was like, so this person really wants to find business partners to develop something up there, because it's magical and it's beautiful. And we were just like, oh, okay, sure, whatever, that sounds nice.
We'll go take a look.
Yeah, but
Sure.
Didn't take it seriously and didn't call the guy back or anything. And it was like 2 or 3 weeks later, the 3 of us are in the car driving, and we stop at a stop sign, and there's the guy walking down the street, and he sees us in the car, and he's like, oh, it's you. And so he comes over and he's like, so do you guys want to come see the land? Do you want to come see the place? Because I really want you to come up. So Dan went up, I think the next day, because I had a job that I had to go to.
Ooh,
but
those
Dan ran the
jobs.
comic book store, so he managed his own schedule. And he went up, and then, that night after I got home from work and Dan got down the mountain, he was just like stars in his eyes. He's like, this place is incredible. The view is magical. And building something up there with like a fantasy theme would just fit it perfectly. And, we can do something great there. And I was like, okay, tell me more about it. And he goes, well, there's no running water and there's no electricity and it's really far away.
Perfect.
I was like,
Perfect.
okay.
The nearest road is over a kilometer away.
Yeah. And why should we do this? But honestly, Dan's enthusiasm was so infectious. Like he was like a little kid describing this magical land to me that I just fell in love with the idea of the project before I had even gone up the mountain.
Oh.
And of course, this is a stranger to us. So I was like, we're going to do business with a person we don't know. So it's a little scary. So I was always like the voice of reason being like, come back down to earth. Because as amazing as this idea sounds, we still have to be realistic about it.
That's what Anna always is the voice of reason.
Yeah.
And this is great because like I'll have some crazy idea and I'll be like, what if we sold goats off a boat? And she'll be like, no, that's crazy. What are you thinking?
How are you going to get the goats on the boat? Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. Goats on a boat. So I'm going to have you just say what there's so much to tell, and I think we're going to do that in the next episode, but I'm going to end the episode here with sort of a teaser. Dan, you had said to us, what the comic book store was making a month, and what you hoped that this fantasy theme park would make in a month, and it way exceeded your expectations.
Yeah. So the comic book store, I was very happy if we made 15,000 quetzales in a month. That's around $2,000. My bills were very low at the time. I was a young single guy living in Guatemala. $2,000 a month was like great. Run the business and have money.
And then my salary complemented that.
So we were feeling okay and comfortable with that income. And we thought, okay, so if this, fantasy hotel takes off and we got a few cabins going up there, we could increase our income by 10,000 Q a month. And that would be great. Like that's another like $1,200. And within a year of opening, the theme park was making around 8 to 10 million quetzales a year. And I remember one weekend in particular, we made more on a Sunday than the comic shop made in a year. And that was when I was like, maybe I need to stop focusing on the comic shop.
And that was wise. I mean, first of all, you can't have a foot in each place. And on top of a mountain, that's a long stretch for the other foot.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yes. And when being away from the comic shop definitely suffered.
Yeah. You were the comic shop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to end this episode, and until next time, we'll go to part 2 of this when the fantasy theme park comes to fruition. And they're just unbelievable, these two. That there's more, but wait, there's more. So we'll be back next time with the next episode of Dan and Anna. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Good to have you here. Love you, Dan and Anna.
Love you, Bob. Love you, Susan.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please share this with a friend and subscribe where you listen to podcasts. Please support our efforts through Patreon at TheKnifeWife, and for all Terzuola goodness, go to Terzuola.net. And remember, if you're not laughing, you're not living. Comments and questions can be made on Instagram at The KnifeWife Podcast or our Facebook group, The KnifeWife Podcast. And if you're a couple who work together and would like to be on our podcast, tell us about yourself with an email at eccentricsuz.com or terzuola.net.